There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a happy family. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of people who have nothing left to say to each other. Something far more complicated than that. It is the silence of people who love each other so much that they have quietly agreed without ever sitting down to make the agreement, without ever putting it into words, to let certain things go unasked, to let certain doors stay closed, to love each other in the shape of the space between what is said and what is not. We build our lives inside these silences. We arrange furniture around them. We plan holiday dinners and birthday parties and Sunday morning pancake breakfasts, and we call it a family, and we mean it. We do mean it. The love is real. The pancakes are real. The laughter across the kitchen table is real. And then one Tuesday afternoon or a Saturday morning or a random Wednesday in March, something small happens. A phone left on a counter, a message that lights up before you can look away, a text thread with a name you do not recognize, and the silence that you have been living inside all this time cracks open. And what spills out is not what you expected. It is not rage, not always. Sometimes it is something quieter and stranger than rage. Sometimes it is a kind of recognition, the feeling that somewhere deep in a part of yourself you have never visited, you already knew. You have known for a while, you just did not have the words for what you knew, and so you called it something else. You called it stress, you called it distance, you called it a rough patch, you called it marriage. This is the story of Jake Novak, 26 years old, owner of a food truck in Columbus, Ohio, a man who describes himself as someone who asks the questions other people are too careful to ask. He borrowed his brother-in-law's phone one afternoon to look up a recipe, a simple thing, carnitas, maybe, or a sauce he had been trying to get right for weeks. He was not looking for anything else, but the phone lit up, and a thread from someone named Alex told him everything he needed to know about his sister's marriage, and everything he needed to know about why Tom Garza, his sister Rachel's husband, 33 years old, high school football coach, a man Jake had known and genuinely liked for 4 years, had been walking around like a ghost for the last 6 months. Here is the question the story asks, and I want you to sit with it before we begin. What do you do with love that was real, absolutely, genuinely, no question about it real, when you discover that the shape it took was built in part on a silence so deep that the person inside it could not breathe? Do you keep the love? Do you keep the silence? Can you keep one without the other? And here is the harder question beneath that one. Is the person who kept the silence, who lived inside it, who built a life inside it, who loved you from inside it, are they a liar? Or are they just a person who did not yet know how to tell you the truest thing about themselves? Jake Novak is going to sit across from us tonight and try to answer that. He is going to do it the way he does everything, without a filter, without softening the edges, with the particular directness of someone who has spent years working a food truck and learned early that the world does not give you much time to be indirect. He is also going to tell you about his sister Rachel, about her watercolors, about the way she paints the light. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, you might find yourself asking whether the most bittersweet things in life are the ones where no one is entirely the villain, where everyone, in their own way, was trying to love someone else as well as they knew how, where the damage was real and the love was also real, and somehow, impossibly, both of those things are still true at the same time. The phone lit up on a Thursday afternoon in October, and nothing, not one single ordinary thing has been the same since. Welcome back to The Straight Spouse. I'm Harvey. And if you are new here, first of all, thank you for being here, genuinely, because this show exists because of people who are brave enough to seek out these stories, and I do not take that lightly. This is a show about people who have been through one of the most quietly devastating experiences a person can go through. Discovering that the person you married, the person you built your life with, is gay, or lesbian, or bisexual, or queer, in ways that were never fully on the table when you said yes. We call them straight spouses. And their stories deserve to be told with the kind of care and honesty and full humanity that they rarely get. A quick note before we get into tonight's episode, because I want to be transparent with you the way I always am. The story you're about to hear is real. The emotions are real. The events are real. The people at the center of this are real human beings who lived through something that changed everything. The way we produced it, some of the visuals, some of the supporting elements, has been built with AI tools. And I think you deserve to know that. But the story itself, that belongs to the people who lived it. And I want to say something else, because this matters to me and it matters to this show. The Straight Spouse is not a show about villains. The LGBT people at the center of these stories, they are not the enemy. They are not the bad guys. They are people who, for reasons that have everything to do with fear and shame and survival and a world that has not always been safe for them, could not find their way to their truth before it hurt someone they loved. That is tragic for everyone. And this show holds space for all of that, for the straight spouse who is grieving and for the LGBT person who is also, in their own way, grieving. We are here to understand, not to judge, not to take sides. If you have been through something like what Jake is about to describe, if you are a straight spouse, if you are someone who has loved a straight spouse, if you are the LGBT person on the other side of one of these stories, then this show is for you. And if it lands for you, if it reaches something in you that you have not been able to reach alone, I would be so grateful if you'd subscribe, share it with someone who might need it, leave a comment. The community that's forming around this show is one of the most honest, most generous communities I've ever been a part of, and every new person who finds it makes it bigger and better. Tonight's guest is 26 years old. He owns a food truck in Columbus, Ohio. He is a small business owner. He got into it young. And if you know anything about the food truck world, you know that takes a particular kind of stubbornness and grit that not a lot of people have. He is the younger brother in his family. He is not the person at the center of tonight's story. He is the person who walked into the middle of it sideways by accident on an ordinary afternoon when he was looking for a recipe. He is also, by his own description, a person who asks the questions other people are too careful to ask. You are going to see that tonight. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Harvey. Good to be here. Or I guess good is a weird word for it, but yeah, I'm here.
You're here. That's already something. Let me start where I always like to start before all of it, before the afternoon that changed things. Tell me about your life. Tell me about your family. Before any of this happened, what did a normal week look like for you?
Normal week. Okay. So I'm up early, like embarrassingly early. The truck has to be stocked and prepped before I hit my first spot, which for me is usually near the Short North, the Arts District in Columbus. I'm there by 6:30 most mornings. It's cold in the winter. Obviously, Ohio winters are not exactly a food truck operator's best friend, but you learn to layer up and you learn to love the regulars who show up anyway. There's something kind of beautiful about that, actually. People who want your food badly enough to stand outside in 20-degree weather for it. So that's my mornings. Afternoons, I'm either at a second spot or doing the prep work for the next day. And then evenings, if I'm not wiped out, I'm usually with family. We're a pretty tight family. Our parents, my mom, Barbara, she's a librarian, and my dad, Gary, he's an electrician. They're both still in Columbus, both still in the same house where we grew up. And Sunday dinners were always a thing. Sunday dinner was just a given. You showed up unless you were dead or hospitalized.
And Rachel was always there.
Rachel was always there. Rachel and Tom. Tom started coming to Sunday dinners before they were even officially a couple. He just fit. He's a football coach, Tom, which you might think means he's kind of a loud sports guy type, but he's actually not. He's quiet, he's thoughtful, he makes these really good observations about things and then doesn't need anyone to tell him the observation was good. I always liked that about him. I liked him the moment I met him.
Before we get to Tom, tell me about Rachel, your sister. Who is she to you?
Rachel is... Okay, how do I describe Rachel without making her sound like a character in a greeting card? She's 31. She's a freelance copywriter. She's good at it, but that's not really who she is. That's just what she does for money. Who she actually is, she's an artist. She paints watercolors specifically. She has this whole setup in the spare room of her and Tom's house, and she sells prints on Etsy. And she has a following that I think genuinely surprised her when it started growing, because she never thought of herself as someone people would want to look at. She paints mostly light. Like the way light comes through a window in the early morning when the rest of the house is still dark, the way it hits a coffee cup, the way it falls across someone's hands. She has this ability to see these tiny moments of light that other people walk past without noticing, and she puts them on paper. And when you look at her paintings, you think, oh, yeah, I've seen that. I've been in that light. I just didn't know it was something you could hold on to.
That's a beautiful way to describe it.
She's a beautiful painter. I'm not being a biased brother. She genuinely is. I have three of her prints in my apartment, and I'm not a person who puts art on his walls, generally, but hers, yeah.
So, this is the world before: a family that shows up for Sunday dinner, a sister who paints light, a brother in law who fits. What was your honest sense of Rachel and Tom's marriage? Before everything?
Honest sense, I thought they were good. I thought they were really good. He was attentive to her in this way that was never showy about it. Like, he didn't make a big production of taking care of her. He just did it. He'd refill her glass before she noticed it was empty. He knew exactly how she took her coffee without ever making a thing of knowing. And Rachel, she was easy with him. She laughed at his jokes, which are not always very funny, and she laughed at them in a way that was genuine. You can tell the difference. You can always tell the difference between someone who is performing ease and someone who is actually at ease. Rachel was at ease. She was happy. Or I thought she was happy. I thought they both were. And maybe they were. That's the part that still gets me. Maybe they were happy in every way they knew how to be.
That every way they knew how to be is doing a lot of work in that sentence.
Yeah, it is. And I didn't know I was going to say it that way until it came out. But yeah.
I want to hold on to that. But first, take me back, not to the afternoon with the phone yet, take me back to a specific memory of the four of you together. A moment that felt, at the time, completely perfect.
There's one that I keep coming back to. Last summer, it was late July, one of those Columbus Julys where the heat sits on you like something alive, and the evenings are this soft, warm, still kind of beautiful. Rachel and Tom had a backyard cookout. Just us, me, my parents, the two of them. Nothing fancy. Tom was grilling. My dad was doing the thing where he pretends to supervise the grilling but is really just drinking his beer. And my mum and Rachel were at the table with these big glasses of iced tea. And Rachel had her sketchbook out because she always has her sketchbook out. She was doing these quick pencil studies of the light coming through the leaves just for herself, not for anything. I remember watching her do that and thinking, this is it. This is what it looks like when a person is exactly where they are supposed to be. She was so focused and so relaxed at the same time. And Tom kept glancing over at her from the grill with this look that I can only describe as tenderness, not performance, just genuine, quiet tenderness. And then at some point, my mom said something, I don't even remember what, some little observation about the evening, and all five of us just laughed. That real laugh where everyone gets it at the same moment. And the evening light was doing exactly what Rachel had been drawing, coming through the leaves in these long gold bars. And I thought, this is my family. I am lucky as hell.
When you look back at that evening now, does anything read differently?
The way Tom looked when he thought nobody was watching. Not at Rachel, just out. At nothing. There were a couple of moments where he went somewhere else. And I noticed it in that vague way where you notice something and then your brain goes probably nothing and you keep eating your burger. I didn't let myself stay with it. I had no reason to stay with it. Everything looked fine. Everything looked happy. Why would I stay with it?
How long ago was that evening?
14 months ago, roughly. And then about 6 months after that, so maybe 8 months ago from now, is when I started noticing that Tom looked different. Like something was draining out of him slowly. But we hadn't gotten there yet last July. Last July, he was still present, still himself, mostly.
I want to go to those 6 months when things started to shift. But before I do, you mentioned Tom at the grill, glancing over at Rachel, the two of them together in that backyard. How would you describe their dynamic, the texture of how they were with each other?
Comfortable. That's the word I always would have used. They had that shorthand that couples get after a few years, the way they could finish each other's thoughts, the way Rachel would reach over and fix the collar of Tom's shirt without breaking the conversation she was having with someone else. And Tom would just let her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. They teased each other, but it never had any edge in it. It was the kind of teasing where the affection is doing most of the talking. I will say this, and I'm saying it now because I've had time to think about it, not because I was thinking it then. They weren't physically affectionate in public, not in a weird way. They didn't avoid touching each other, they just weren't demonstrative. I always chalk that up to Tom being a pretty private person in general. Some people are like that. Not everyone is a big public PDA couple, but I've thought about it since. I've thought about it a lot.
Hold that thought. I want to stay in that backyard a little longer. Because you described something that I think a lot of people recognize, that thing where everything looks right, where the ingredients of a happy family are all present and accounted for. Sunday dinners, a sister who paints, a brother-in-law who fits. When you're inside that, do you ever question it? Does the ease of it ever feel like something to examine? Or does it just feel like good luck?
Man, I think when things are going well, we are very strongly motivated not to examine them. There is something almost superstitious about it. Like, don't look directly at the happiness, or you might scare it off. We were the kind of family that didn't have a lot of drama growing up. My parents never went through anything like a bad divorce or a major financial catastrophe or anything like that. We were middle class and stable and a little boring in the best possible way. And I think because we were lucky, because the floor had always held, none of us had ever really learned to ask if the floor was solid. We just walked on it. Rachel and Tom's marriage looked solid. It looked like the kind of marriage that people who had thought carefully about things build for themselves. They bought a house together. They had plans. They talked about kids, though not constantly. And whenever the subject came up, Rachel would get this quiet, reflective look that I always read as just her being thoughtful. She was always thoughtful. I never read it as anything other than that.
And Tom, in those early years, who was he to you, not as Rachel's husband, but as a person you were actually getting to know?
Tom was the kind of person I wanted in my corner. That sounds like a weird way to say it, but it's the most accurate thing I know. He was steady. He had this quality where nothing rattled him, not in a cold way, not in that shut down way some men have, where nothing rattles them because they've turned everything off. He was steady because he thought things through, because he had values and he stuck to them. He coached high school football and he was genuinely good at it, not just in the wins and losses sense, but in the sense that his players trusted him. I went to a couple of their games and I watched those kids look at him on the sideline and I thought, that's a person people believe in. That's a person who makes you feel like things are going to be okay. He was funny too, dry. He had this very dry, very quiet sense of humor where he'd say something and then just look at you, and the joke lived in the look. Rachel had the same sense of humor. That's one of the things that made them work. I think they found the same things quietly funny.
You said around 6 months ago things shifted with Tom. Walk me there. What did you start noticing?
It was gradual at first, so gradual that I kept second guessing whether I was seeing something real. The first thing I noticed was the coffee, which sounds like nothing, but it was so unlike him. Tom always has his coffee ready at the same time every morning. He's a creature of habit. He coaches high school football. His whole life runs on a schedule. But I started noticing when I'd be over for Sunday dinner and stay for breakfast the next morning that his coffee would be sitting on the counter getting cold. He'd poured it and then he'd just walked away from it and forgotten about it, which for Tom was like leaving a part of himself behind. Then there was the weight. He lost maybe 15 pounds over the space of 3 months. Not dramatic, not alarming on its face, but on someone who had always been really particular about his fitness. Football coaches live and die by the physical example they set for their players. It was noticeable.
Did he offer any explanation? Did he attribute it to anything?
He said he was cutting back, watching what he ate, which is a thing coaches do sometimes. They go in cycles with that. And it was plausible enough that I believed it. I wanted to believe it. It gave me somewhere to put the observation and stop thinking about it. That's what we do with things we're not ready to look at, right? We find a plausible explanation and we hang the observation on it and we move on. The explanation doesn't have to be airtight, it just has to be enough. Then there was the way he was at Sunday dinners. He was still there, he showed up, he laughed at the right moments, he helped my dad with whatever needed helping, but there was something behind his eyes that was just not there. Like someone had turned a lamp down to its lowest setting. He was present in body, but the light was dimmer.
Did Rachel notice?
That's the thing I couldn't tell. And I didn't ask. I kept thinking it was not my place to ask. You know how that goes. It's their marriage. He's probably just stressed about the season, or something at work, or just going through a thing. People go through things. You don't interrogate your brother-in-law about why he looks sad at dinner.
But you kept watching.
I kept watching because that's what I do. I watch people. You spend enough years running a food truck, reading customers, figuring out who's about to order what before they open their mouth. You get pretty good at watching. And what I was watching with Tom was a person who was carrying something that was getting heavier every time I saw him. And I had no idea what it was. There was one Sunday, this was maybe 2 months before the afternoon with the phone, where I was helping Tom clear the dishes after dinner, just the two of us in the kitchen for a few minutes. And I almost asked him, I had the question right there. I was going to say, man, are you okay? Like, actually okay. But I looked at him and he was staring at the water running over his hands in the sink, just staring at it like he'd forgotten what he was supposed to be doing with it. And something in the way he was standing, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he was holding himself like something fragile made me swallow the question. It felt too big for the kitchen. It felt like opening a door I didn't know how to open. So I just said, hey, you want me to dry? And he said, yeah, thanks. And we finished the dishes. And I drove home that night with that almost question still sitting in my chest, getting heavier.
That image, Tom, staring at the water running over his hands, what does it feel like now, knowing what you know?
Like he was already underwater. Like he had been underwater for a long time by then, and I was standing right next to him, and I didn't know how to see it. And I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because that's what secrets do. They live inside people, and they look like something else from the outside. They look like stress. They look like a bad season. They look like a grown man who's tired and needed a minute at the sink. But here's the thing that really got me, and I've only admitted this to one person before tonight. At some point in those weeks before the phone, I started to feel like something was wrong with Rachel, too. Not wrong, like she seemed unhappy. Wrong, like she seemed careful, more careful than usual. Like she was choosing her words in a way she never used to have to choose them. I noticed it one night when my mum asked how they were thinking about the holidays, and Rachel answered, and it was a perfectly normal answer. Nothing weird about the content, but there was a half-second pause before she started talking. The tiniest thing, the kind of pause that most people would never catch. I caught it. And then I told myself I was reading things into nothing. And I went home and I tried not to think about it.
But you couldn't stop thinking about it.
No, I couldn't. And what I couldn't figure out was, were they just both going through something hard? Did Rachel know something was wrong with Tom that she wasn't telling us? Or was there something they both knew that neither of them was going to say out loud? I went around and around on it. And then about 2 weeks later, I was over at their place on a Thursday afternoon to pick up a Dutch oven. Rachel had lent me for a recipe. I was testing something I wanted to try on the truck, one of those braises that takes all day. And Tom was home and his phone was on the kitchen counter and I needed to look something up.
Before we get there, I want to stay in those weeks leading up to it because I think you were doing something that a lot of people do and don't have language for. You were watching someone you loved and feeling something you couldn't name. Was there a specific moment in that period where you thought, I need to say something, where you almost broke the silence you'd both been keeping?
There were two moments, actually. The first one, I mentioned the dishes when I swallowed the question. The second one was a Friday night, probably 3 weeks before the phone. Rachel had texted me to come over for leftover soup, which is a thing she does. She'll make a huge pot of something and then text people to come eat it rather than let it go to waste. Very her. I showed up and Tom was already in bed, which was odd. It was 8:30 and Rachel said he'd had a migraine, which was plausible enough. But when I looked at her while she said it, she was doing that careful thing again, that word choosing thing. And we ate the soup and we talked about my truck, a new menu item. I was trying something with pickled jalapenos, and she showed me two new watercolor pieces she'd been working on. One of them was this study of kitchen light, a windowsill at dusk, the last of the day, coming in at a low angle. And it was so specific and so quiet and so beautiful that I had to look at it for a full minute. And then I made myself look at Rachel instead. And I said, are you okay? And she said, yes, of course. Why wouldn't I be? And she smiled at me. And the smile reached her eyes. I believe the smile reached her eyes. But the pause before it, that pause, I drove home that night and I sat in my truck for 5 minutes in the parking lot of my apartment building. And I thought, something is happening in that house, something I don't have access to. And then I went inside and went to bed and did not let myself go further with it.
3 weeks later, A Thursday afternoon, a Dutch oven, a phone on a counter.
A phone on a counter. Tom was out back doing something in the yard. I'd come in through the front and we'd said hi and he'd said, help yourself. And I'd said, I just need to pull up a recipe real quick. My phone is almost dead. Can I use yours? And he said, yeah, sure, no problem. And I picked up the phone.
What did you see?
The screen lit up the moment I touched it. Not because of a notification, just the way touch screens light up when you pick them up. And right there on the lock screen, there was a preview, a text message preview. You know how they show the first line or two before you unlock from a contact named Alex? And the preview said, I remember it exactly. I will remember it forever. It said, I know you said we needed to stop talking, but I can't keep doing this. I think about you every... And then it cut off. Because that's what previews do. I stood there holding the phone. Tom was 40 feet away, outside, not looking at me. And I stood there holding the phone and I felt the floor drop out. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Not a dramatic crash, just a quiet, absolute removal of something solid I'd been standing on without knowing I was standing on it. And then, and this is the part that I have never said out loud to anyone, not even to Rachel, my first thought was not about Tom. My first thought was about Rachel, about the pause, about the word choosing, about the soup on a Friday night with her husband already in bed at 8:30, about 4 years of Sunday dinners and a backyard cookout in July, and the way she paints the light coming through kitchen windows. My second thought was, how long? My third thought was, she knows.
You put the phone back down.
I put the phone back down, and Tom came in from the yard, still not knowing, and he said, find what you needed. And I said, yeah, got it. And I grabbed the Dutch oven, and I said I'd see him Sunday. And I walked to my truck, and I sat in their driveway for 2 full minutes before I started the engine. And then I drove home, and I did not sleep that night. And I did not call Rachel, and I did not call Tom. And for 3 days, I went to work and opened the truck and served food and made change and smiled at my regulars and had absolutely no idea what to do with what I now knew, because I didn't technically know anything. I had a 3-line preview of a text message from someone named Alex. That was the entirety of my evidence. It was also the entirety of the case I needed, because it was not just the text. It was everything the text made legible. All those Sunday dinners, the cold coffee, the 15 pounds, the way Tom stood at the sink with the water running over his hands, the pause in Rachel's voice when she answered a question about the holidays, the soup on a Friday night, the print of the kitchen window at dusk, the last light coming in at a low angle, Rachel painting it at 8:30 while her husband slept alone down the hall. All of it. Suddenly, all of it was a different picture. And I had no idea whether Rachel had been living inside that picture for a day or a week or 4 years.
3 days went by before you did anything.
3 days. And then on Sunday, the next Sunday dinner, I walked into my parents' house and I looked at Rachel across the kitchen and she looked at me and something in her face changed. Just for a second, just a flicker. Like she could see the weight of what I was carrying. And I thought, she knows I know. Somehow she knows. And I thought, okay, we're going to have to do this. But that's the next part of the story.
I want to stay right there for a second, that moment across the kitchen. You walk in on Sunday, you look at Rachel, and something passes between you. You said you thought, she knows I know. What made you read it that way? What exactly did you see in her face?
It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't like she went pale or she flinched or anything like that. It was more like, you know, sometimes you can see a person register something, not react, just register. Like the moment between when the information arrives and when the face decides what to do with it. That's what I saw. This tiny window where she looked at me and her eyes did something, not fear exactly, more like a kind of recognition, like she'd been bracing for this exact moment and now it was here, and her face hadn't caught up with what her body already knew to do. And then it was gone. Her face closed over it, smooth as water, and she said, Jake, you made it. And she came around the counter and hugged me, and it was the exact hug she always gives me. Normal length, normal warmth, 2 pats on the back. And I hugged her back and I thought, okay, she's not going to say anything tonight. And I'm not going to push it tonight. And we're going to sit at this table and eat my mum's pot roast, and we're going to be exactly who we've always been to each other tonight. And we're going to let that be enough for tonight.
And was it enough?
For that night, yeah. In a way that hurt more than it helped, but yeah.
What do you mean hurt more than it helped?
Because sitting there at that table, watching Rachel laugh at my dad's story about a job site, watching her help my mum clear the plates, watching Tom sit across from me with that lamp turned down look in his eyes, sitting there pretending to be the version of ourselves that existed before Thursday afternoon, it felt like grief. Not anger, grief. Like I was already mourning something that was still technically alive. Like we were all sitting in the middle of the ending without anyone having said it out loud yet. And the worst part, and I want to say this clearly because I think it matters, the worst part wasn't the lying. It wasn't even the text from Alex. The worst part was looking at Tom across the table and suddenly seeing him differently. Not as the enemy, not as a villain, just as a person who was in so much pain that he had stopped being able to hide it and who had been trying to hide it for God knows how long and who had clearly tried and failed and tried again and who was now sitting across from his brother-in-law who had picked up his phone 3 days ago and who Tom didn't know knew. And I felt something I was not expecting to feel. I felt sorry for him.
That surprises you.
It surprised the hell out of me. I wanted to be angry. Anger would have been so much cleaner. Anger makes sense. Sympathy for the person who is whatever he is to Rachel, whatever he's been doing, whatever the text from Alex means. Sympathy is not the emotion you write on the package. But there it was.
I think about what you're describing, and I find myself wondering in that space between Thursday and Sunday, those 3 days when you're running your truck and not calling anyone, were you also doing the math on what you didn't know? Because you still only had a preview. You had a name, Alex, and 3 lines. You didn't have the full picture.
Oh, I was doing all the math constantly. Alex could be a woman. Tom could be having an affair with a woman, which would be its own category of devastation, but a completely different story. I kept running that possibility. I kept trying to put it up against everything else I'd observed over those months, the weight, the distance, the particular quality of Tom's unhappiness, which somehow felt very specific to me, very internal, not the way a man looks when he's guilty about a woman. But I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. And I didn't have the right to go back and unlock his phone and read the thread. So I sat with the incomplete picture.
And then Sunday happened. And then walk me past Sunday. Because something had to shift. That look you described across the kitchen, something had to happen after that.
On Wednesday of that week, it was a Wednesday, I'm sure about that because Wednesday is my slower day and I had more brain space. Rachel texted me, she said, "Can we talk? Not tonight, not tomorrow, but when you have time, can we talk? Just the two of us." And I read that and I sat with it for about 10 seconds and then I texted back, "Yes, tell me when." She said, "Saturday, come by for coffee? Noon?" I said, "I'll be there." And then I put my phone down and I finished the jalapeno brine and I did not think about Saturday. As much as a person can manage to not think about something that is the only thing they are actually thinking about. The week after that Sunday was the longest week of my life. I went about my days. I opened the truck. I changed the menu board. I tested the new jalapeno brine. I did all of it on autopilot, while about 30% of my brain was continuously running the loop of everything I'd seen and everything I didn't know and what I was supposed to do with it.
That Wednesday text from Rachel, did it settle something for you? Did it confirm what you'd suspected that she knew?
It confirmed that we were going to have a conversation that was different from all the conversations we'd had before. Whether that was because she knew I'd seen the phone or because she'd been waiting for someone to give her an opening to say something she couldn't say alone, I didn't know. I still don't know entirely. I've never asked her directly how much she knew was coming before that Saturday. Some things you just let be the version you have.
Saturday. Tell me about Saturday.
I got there at noon. Tom's car wasn't in the driveway. I noticed that immediately. I rang the bell, which I never do. I just knock and walk in, but that day I rang the bell. Rachel opened the door and she'd made coffee. Good coffee. The pour over kind she only makes when she's trying to do something carefully. We sat at the kitchen table, and for about 3 minutes we talked about nothing. The weather had turned. My jalapeno thing. Something she'd seen on Instagram. And then Rachel put both hands flat on the table, and she looked at me, and she said, "I think you already know most of what I'm about to tell you." And I said, "I think you're right." And she took a breath and she said, "Tom is gay."
What happened in your body when she said that?
Everything went very still. Not quiet, I could still hear the neighbor's dog and a car going by outside, and the refrigerator humming. but everything in me went still, like the bottom of a lake when there's no wind. And I thought, there it is. There's the full sentence. That's what the 3 lines in the preview were heading toward. And I looked at Rachel, and she was holding herself with this extraordinary composure, both hands still flat on the table, back straight, eyes steady. And I thought, how long has she been practicing this composure? How long has she been sitting in rooms alone with this sentence, getting used to the shape of it, rehearsing how to say it without falling apart? I said, how long have you known? She said, 4 months. I said, how did you find out? And she told me. She told me that Tom had told her. He'd sat her down one evening in April, this past April, so at 7 months before the Saturday I'm describing, and he had said the thing he'd been trying not to say his entire life, that he had been carrying this since he was a teenager, that he had convinced himself for years that it wasn't what it was, that everyone felt this way, that if he just built the right life, it would be enough, that he had loved Rachel and he still loved Rachel, and that love was real. Every bit of it was real. But there was something in him that he could no longer hold close by force. And Rachel had sat across from him and listened. And she had not fallen apart, not right then, not in front of him. She had been very, very quiet. And when he finished, she asked one question, which was, is there someone? And he said, yes. Someone named Alex. Someone he'd met at a coaches conference 11 months prior.
She was sitting with this for 4 months before you found out by accident.
4 months. Sitting with it alone, or almost alone. She'd told one friend, her best friend from college who lives in Portland, Oregon, and that was it. No family, not me, not our parents, nobody. Because she and Tom were still figuring out what it meant for them, what was going to happen, whether the marriage could take some different shape, whether they needed to separate, whether they were going to tell people and when and how. All of that was still in the air when Tom left his phone on the kitchen counter on a Thursday afternoon in October.
Jake, I have to ask, and I want you to take a second before you answer this, because I think the honest answer is complicated. When Rachel told you all of that on that Saturday, and you were sitting with it, what was the feeling that was the hardest to locate? Not the most obvious one, the hardest one to find.
The hardest one to find, I keep coming back to this, and I'm not sure I've ever found the right word for it. It wasn't anger, though I felt some of that later. It wasn't grief, though that was everywhere. The hardest feeling to locate was something like vertigo. The feeling you get when a room you've been in 1,000 times suddenly looks different from a slightly different angle. Like the proportions are right, but something has shifted. Every conversation I'd ever had in their house, every Sunday dinner, every backyard evening, all of it was the same and also completely different simultaneously. Not erased, not fake, just recontextualized in a way I hadn't agreed to and couldn't undo. And the thing I couldn't square, and I'm going to be honest about this because I think it matters, was that knowing the reason didn't automatically make it okay. And knowing Tom was gay and had been in pain and hadn't meant to hurt anyone and was not a bad person, knowing all of that didn't automatically absorb the hurt. Both things were true at the same time. That he was a good man in an impossible situation. And that my sister had been sitting alone with a seismic truth for 4 months and had not been able to tell her family. Both of those things were true, and neither one erased the other.
That coexistence, I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think that's the thing that most people skip past when they talk about these situations. They want to land somewhere. Good person, bad situation. Victim, perpetrator. But you're describing something that refuses to land.
Yeah. And the refusal to land is the whole thing. That's the actual experience, not the landing.
I want to go back to Rachel in that kitchen on Saturday, the composure. You described it as extraordinary. What did it cost her in your sense of it?
Everything. I think it cost her everything. And I think she'd been paying that cost in installments for 4 months, a little every day, until she'd got into a place where she could sit at her kitchen table and say those 3 words to her brother without the cup falling apart in her hands. But I watched her when she thought I wasn't watching because I was doing my food truck thing, observing. And there was a moment right after she finished telling me about Alex, right after she'd gotten through the part where Tom had told her and she'd asked, is there someone? And he'd said yes. There was a 2-second window where her face did something that it hadn't done while she was talking. It just opened, like a muscle unclenching after holding too long. And then it closed again. And she asked me, are you okay? And I said, no. And I said, but I will be. And I said, I need you to answer one more question right now. She said, okay. I said, what are you going to do?
And what did she say?
She said, I don't know yet. That's what we're trying to figure out. She said it very calmly, like a person who has accepted that they are in the middle of something that is not going to resolve quickly and has made a kind of peace with the pace of it, even if the pace is agony. And I looked at her and I thought, I do not know how she is doing this. I do not know where she found this. But I know that whatever reservoir she is drawing from right now is not infinite. And I need to be someone she can come back to when it runs out. And that was the moment, not the phone, not the conversation, but that moment right there, that was the moment the story changed for me. Because up until that point, I'd been trying to figure out what I knew and what I didn't know and what I was supposed to do. And in that moment, I stopped trying to figure anything out and I just looked at my sister and I thought, what does she need from me right now? And the answer was for me not to fall apart, so I didn't.
That's a very specific kind of love, the kind that holds itself together for the sake of someone else's falling apart. Did you ever let yourself fall apart?
Later, much later. Alone in my apartment on a night about a week after that Saturday, I made a really bad pot of ramen and I sat on my kitchen floor and I cried for about 45 minutes, which is not something I do. But it turns out some things need more space than a chair.
Jake, before we go to what happened next for your family, I want to ask you something about Tom in this specific moment. Not the Tom from the text message, the Tom from the Saturday when Rachel told you. You knew by that point that he'd been the one to come to her, to tell her to initiate the conversation that blew everything open. Does that change anything for you about him?
Yeah, it does. It's one of the things I've had to sit with the most because there's a version of this story where Tom lies forever, where Tom takes the secret to his grave and Rachel lives her whole life inside a marriage that has this enormous thing at the center of it that she is never told. That version exists. A lot of people live that version, and Tom chose not to be that person. He sat her down and he told her in April in their living room. And it would have been the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life up to that point, and he did it anyway. That doesn't erase the damage, it doesn't erase the 4 years, it doesn't erase the grief, but it means something. I think it means something real.
There is so much happening for all of you at this point. Rachel processing, Tom processing, you now carrying the weight of knowing while your parents still don't know, while the Sunday dinners keep happening. How are you managing to show up to those dinners and act like everything was
Badly.
normal?
I mean, I thought I was managing it okay, but looking back, I was definitely running hotter than usual. I was sharper in conversations. I was quicker to change the subject when things got close to Tom and Rachel as a topic. My mum noticed she's a librarian. She reads rooms the way other people read books, quietly and with full attention. And she asked me once at the tail end of one of those Sundays, is something going on with you? And I said, just work stuff. And she gave me the look that all librarians give when they know you've returned a book with a library card that isn't yours. But she let it go. I will say this, those 3 weeks between when I found out and when things finally broke open for the family, those 3 weeks were the loneliest I've ever been. Because I was carrying something I hadn't asked to carry that I couldn't put down. And the one person I wanted to process it with was the person at the center of it.
Those 3 weeks, and then things broke open. Take me there.
I wasn't in the room when Tom told my parents. There was a conversation between Tom and Rachel and Barbara and Gary, and I was not invited to it, which I understood. That wasn't my conversation to be in. Rachel called me the next morning. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I was at a farmer's market prep spot. And I took the call standing in front of the truck with a crate of tomatillos at my feet. And she said, we told them last night. And she said, it wasn't good. And that's where everything goes fast.
She said it wasn't good. How not good?
My dad left the room. That was the first thing Rachel told me. My dad heard what Tom said, stood up from the couch, walked into the kitchen, and started washing dishes that did not need washing. And he stayed there for 20 minutes. And then he came back and sat down and said almost nothing for the rest of the evening. My mum cried. Not immediately, Rachel said she was very still for a while first. The way she gets when something big comes in and she needs to process before she can react. But then she cried. And she held Rachel. And she asked, is there anything I could have done? Which broke my heart when Rachel told me that. Because of course there wasn't. And of course that would be the first place my mum's mind would go.
And Tom was there for all of this?
Tom was there. in the room, on the same couch. Rachel said he sat very still and let it happen around him, let the weight of it land on everyone. She said he cried too, not dramatically, just quietly, in a way that she said looked like relief and grief in the same breath.
What happened after that night?
The following weeks were fractured. That's the word. Things didn't break cleanly. Nothing broke cleanly. Tom stayed in the house for another 3 weeks. They'd agreed on that. Some period of transition while they figured out logistics. My dad did not call Tom during those 3 weeks. My mum called Rachel every day. I stayed in my lane, mostly because Rachel had explicitly asked me to let her manage the pace of things with our parents. But there were conversations. There were two in particular. The first one was between me and my dad. He called me on a Thursday night the week after they told my parents, and he said, "Come over." So I went over. And my dad sat at the kitchen table with a beer. He wasn't drinking. And he said, "I don't understand it." And I said, "I know you don't." And he said, "I want to. I'm trying to, but I don't." And I sat with him. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just sat with him. And after about an hour, he said, "Is Rachel going to be okay?" And I said, "Yeah, she's going to be okay." And he said, "You sure?" And I said, "As sure as I've ever been of anything." He nodded. He went back to not drinking his beer, and something settled between us in that kitchen that hadn't been there before.
That sounds like your father was doing his own private processing, not through words, through presence.
That's my dad, exactly. He processes by proximity. He just needs to be in the room with you. He doesn't always need to say the thing. The being there is the thing.
And the second conversation?
The second one was between me and Tom. About 10 days after my parents found out, Tom texted me and said, "Can we get a beer?" And I said yes, because whatever else was going on, I still believed in Tom as a person, and I thought he deserved to have that yes from me. We went to a bar near his house, not a bar we'd been to before, neutral ground. We sat down, we ordered. There was a pause. I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "Honestly, I feel like I've been holding my breath for 15 years, and I just started breathing." He stopped. That's a terrible thing to say given everything. I said, "No, it's the honest thing." He said, "I keep thinking about all the years I wasted, both of us. Both of us just going." He stopped again. I said, "I know." He said, "Does she hate me?" I said, "No." He said, "Your parents?" I said, "They're finding their way." He said, "Your dad?" I said, "Give him time. That's just how he moves." And we sat with that for a while, just the bar noise around us. And then for the first few minutes, we talked about football, because we're both people, and sometimes you need to come in sideways to the real thing before you can go through the middle of it. And then Tom put his glass down and he looked at me and he said, "I know you saw the text." And I said, "I know." He said, "Rachel told you when you talked to her that Saturday?" I said, "She told me you'd told her. The rest I figured out." He said, "I'm sorry you got pulled into this the way you did." And I said, "Tom, I need to ask you something and I need you to give me the most honest answer you've got." He said, "Okay." And I said, "Did you love her? Do you love her now?" And he didn't answer immediately. He turned the glass around in his hands. And then he said, "Jake, loving Rachel has been the realest thing in my adult life. The fact that what I am made it impossible to be what she needed me to be completely, that's the thing I'm going to carry for the rest of my life. Because the love was not fake. None of it was fake. I just didn't know how to be both things. And I held on too long trying. I believed him. I still believe him."
I have to ask, because this matters for everything that comes after what happened to Alex in all of this.
Tom ended it in November. About a month after the conversation in my parents' living room, he told Rachel he'd ended it, and I believe Rachel believed him. And I think Tom understood that whatever his future looked like, it was not going to be built on something that had been running underneath his marriage. He needed to start from something clean, whatever that meant for him.
And Rachel, what was her state of mind through those weeks of fractured, fast movement?
Rachel was okay. Here's what I'll say about Rachel in those weeks. She was the most controlled, grieving person I have ever seen in my life. And it was both impressive and terrifying. She was managing everyone. She was managing Tom's timeline and my parents' feelings and my access to the story and her own schedule and her Etsy orders and her freelance deadlines. She was not falling apart. She was not going on long crying jags or making anyone else carry her weight. She was moving through the days with this particular quiet efficiency that I recognized from her painting, the same way she approaches a blank page, methodically and with purpose, not wasting motion. And I kept thinking, where is it going? Where is all of this going? Because nobody processes grief by being this efficient about it. It has to go somewhere. And then one afternoon I stopped by unannounced. I know, you're not supposed to, but I had a container of the jalapeno carnitas I'd been working on and I wanted her to try them. And I knocked and there was no answer and the door was unlocked. So I let myself in. And Rachel was in the spare room, her painting room, and she was sitting at her table, not painting, just sitting there with her hands in her lap and the afternoon light coming in through the window and a blank piece of watercolor paper in front of her that had been blank for a while. I could tell. She heard me come in and she turned around and her face looked like a room after all the furniture has been moved out. Not devastated, just empty in a way that was completely different from everything I'd seen from her in the preceding weeks. Completely still and completely not managed and completely real. And she said, I don't know how to paint right now. And I sat down on the floor next to her table and I said, okay. And she said, I've been trying for 3 weeks and I can't find the light. And I didn't say anything to that because there is nothing to say to that. Sometimes you just sit on the floor.
Jake, the image of Rachel sitting at that empty table, unable to find the light she spent her whole artistic life trying to capture, that's going to stay with me. Because it's not just about painting, is it?
No, it's not. The light was the thing she was best at seeing, and she'd lost the ability to see it, even temporarily. And I think that was the truest measure I had of where she actually was.
If you're hearing this and thinking, I know exactly what that moment feels like, to be the person on the floor next to someone you love who has lost access to the thing that made them themselves, or to be Rachel sitting with the blank page, we see you. That quiet, undramatic devastation is its own category of hard, and one of the reasons this community exists is so that people carrying it don't have to carry it in the dark. If that's you, subscribe, leave a comment, find us, because the conversation that Jake is having with us tonight is also a conversation with every person who has ever sat on someone's floor and not known what to say. What happened over the weeks that followed? What did the shape of things look like?
Tom moved out in mid-November. He found a short-term rental about 4 miles from the house, close enough that the logistics of disentangling didn't require geography to complicate them. Rachel stayed in the house. They'd agreed on that she loved the house. It was the house with the painting room, and whatever else was changing, she wasn't going to lose the painting room. My parents went through their own separate process that I was only partially inside. My dad came around faster than I expected, which surprised me, because he's the quieter of the two, the one who processes slow. I think what did it was watching how Rachel was handling it. My dad respects competence and he respects grace, and Rachel was showing both, even at cost to herself. And I think that landed on him in a way that arguments wouldn't have. My mom had a harder time, actually. Not with the idea of Tom being gay. My mom is not someone who has a problem with that on principle, but with the betrayal of it, with the time, 4 years of Sunday dinners, and she'd sat across from this man and poured him coffee and asked about his season and thought she was seeing the full picture of who he was. The discovery that there was a whole interior landscape she'd never been permitted to see that hurt her in a way that was specific to her, specific to the particular kind of attentiveness she brings to people she loves. She said to me once, about 6 weeks after everything came out, I thought I was a good reader of people. And I said, you are. You're the best reader of people I know. And she said, then how did I miss it? And I said, because he wasn't giving you anything to read. He wasn't performing anything. He was just surviving. And surviving doesn't have a tell. She thought about that for a while. I'm not sure it fully helped, but it was the truest thing I had.
Twist number 4, the thing that caught you off guard. What came from an unexpected direction in those weeks?
The unexpected thing was Tom's players, his football team. This is the part of the story that I did not see coming and that I think about a lot. Because when Tom's situation became something that people in the community started knowing about, and in a town the size of theirs, the school's social community, word travels, there was about a 72-hour window where I genuinely didn't know what was going to happen to his job, to his standing with those kids. High school football coach, small school, conservative enough suburb of Columbus, I had fears, real fears. And then one of his senior players, this kid named Marcus, 17 years old, starting linebacker, kid who had been in Tom's program for 3 years, Marcus apparently texted Tom directly and said, Coach, we're with you. The team is with you. Don't worry about us. And then at practice the following Monday, which Tom had considered not showing up to because he didn't know what he was walking into, the team lined up as normal. Nobody said anything about it. They just ran their drills and they listened to their coach and they played football. And at the end of practice, Marcus came up to Tom and did the thing where you knock helmets together, shoulder to shoulder, the way players do with coaches they trust. And Tom told Rachel that was the moment he cried for the first time since April, standing on the practice field in the November cold with 17-year-old Marcus and a team that had decided it didn't matter. I did not expect that. I genuinely did not expect that.
The grace of teenagers, it catches you off guard every time.
Every single time. Those kids were 17 years old and they figured out exactly what to do when it mattered.
And the community more broadly, the people who were not the football team,
Mixed. I'll be honest about that. There were people who were decent and people who made it harder than it needed to be. There was a couple friends of my parents, people they'd known for 15 years, who basically stopped calling. No confrontation, no conversation, just a gradual cooling and then silence. That hurt my mum more than any direct hostility would have. The politeness of the erasure. And there were a few people at the school, not kids, adults, who made comments. Nothing legally actionable, just that particular brand of cruelty where people say things that have no target on them that they could always deny, but that everybody in the room knows exactly who they're aimed at. Tom navigated it. He kept his job. He finished the season. He coached his team through playoffs, and they made it one round further than the previous year. And when the season ended, he sat down with his athletic director and they had a direct conversation, and his job was safe. That's not a small thing. I know it's not a small thing.
how did Rachel feel about Tom keeping his job, his presence in the community, him staying geographically close? Was that complicated for her?
She told me once that it would have been simpler if he'd left. Not better, just simpler. Because the geography of him being 4 miles away meant she still ran into the life they'd had together on a regular basis. She'd see his car in the parking lot of the grocery store. She'd drive past the school and know he was in there. She'd go to a Sunday farmer's market and half the people there had known them as a couple. All of those small daily collisions with the ordinary geography of a shared life. But she also told me, and this came later, much later, that having him close was part of how she got through it because they weren't enemies. They were trying slowly and imperfectly and not without hard conversations to figure out what they were to each other on the other side of what they'd been. And you can't do that from opposite coasts.
There's something I want to ask about the holidays because you were moving into late November when Tom moved out. Thanksgiving was coming. What happened to Sunday dinners? What happened to the shape of your family's calendar during all of this?
Thanksgiving was the strangest one. My mum wanted Tom there. That sounds counterintuitive, but it's my mum. She runs toward the discomfort rather than away from it, always has. And Rachel wanted him there too. So he came. He drove over in the late afternoon and he sat at the same table he'd sat at for 4 years and he helped my dad with the dishes. Because, of course, my dad has a rule that the guest who least wants to do the dishes is the one who has to do them. And it was quiet and a little fragile and also weirdly tender. Like everyone in that room was being very careful with everyone else. The way you are when something precious is cracked and you're not sure yet whether it can be repaired, but you're not throwing it away. My dad and Tom did the dishes for 45 minutes without saying much, but they did them together. And when Tom left, my dad stood at the door and said, "Drive safe." And Tom said, "Yes, sir." And my dad nodded. That was it. That was everything. The day after Thanksgiving, I was at the truck. We do a big day after brunch spot, and I was standing there making breakfast burritos at 6:30 in the morning, and I suddenly had to stop because I was crying behind the steam table. Darius pretended not to notice. I'm going to keep giving that kid raises.
Because of the dishes?
Because of the dishes. Because my dad is a man of extremely few words, and somehow he managed to say everything he needed to say by washing dishes with a man whose truth had upended the last 4 years of his family's life. That's the kind of grace I want to be capable of when it's my turn. I don't know if I am, but I want to be.
And the Sunday dinners?
The
That
Sunday
instinct to
dinners
keep
kept
showing
going
up, I think that's the
without
through
Tom for
line
a
of your whole
while,
family in this
just the
story.
four of us. And then eventually with Tom rejoining occasionally when Rachel decided that was what she wanted. There was no clean rule book for how to do any of it. Everyone just kept showing up and we figured it out week by week. Yeah, for better or worse, that's who we are. We show up. even when we don't know what we're showing up for.
That what they were to each other on the other side. I want to come back to that. But first, I want to ask you something that I don't think we've fully addressed yet. You've been describing everyone else's experience through all of this. Your parents, Tom, Rachel, Marcus, and the football team. What about you, Jake? What happened to you in those weeks?
What happened to me? Okay. What happened to me was I poured myself into the truck. I mean, that literally, I did a full menu overhaul during those 6 weeks, tested probably 30 new items, drove my prep cost through the roof. My one employee, a college kid named Darius, told me at the end of November that he'd never worked so hard in his life and he needed a raise, and I gave him one. The truck is the thing I control. It's the one space in my life where the inputs reliably produce the outputs, where if something isn't working, I can adjust it and try again, and eventually it works, or I accept it doesn't and I move on. Life does not operate on those terms. Grief does not operate on those terms. So I went somewhere that did. But here's the truth underneath that. The truth underneath the jalapeno carnitas and the 30 menu items and the raise for Darius, I was angry. I was genuinely, quietly, deeply angry in a way I hadn't admitted to myself until about 2 months in. Not at Tom, not exactly, not at Rachel, just at the shape of it. At the fact that 4 years of Sunday dinners and backyard cookouts and a family that I believed in had a room in it that I'd never been let into. That people I loved had been living in private agony that I was not permitted to see. That the floor had been less solid than I'd thought, and nobody had told me, and I'd been walking on it in good faith. That anger is valid, I think. I think it's allowed. I just had to find it before I could let it go.
The room inside the happy family that you were never let into. That's going back to the question narrator asked at the very beginning of tonight. Isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I want to ask you one more thing before we move forward. You described sitting on the floor of Rachel's painting room. You described the jalapeno carnitas and the ramen and the 45 minutes crying. All of these very concrete, very specific things. Is that how you process through things, through the physical and particular?
That's exactly how I process. Always has been. I am not a person who sits with abstraction very well. The truck is evidence of that. When something is wrong, I need to chop something, or fix something, or drive somewhere, or make something I haven't made before. The body knows things the brain is still catching up to. And for me, the body is always the way in, which is part of why the phone mattered so much. Not as information as an object in my hands, something concrete and cold and real. It made the abstract thing into a physical thing, and I could start from there. The first morning I woke up and thought something had shifted was in late January, about 3 months after everything came out. And it wasn't anything large. I want to be clear about that. It was not a moment of revelation, not a sunrise epiphany, not anything that would make a good scene in a movie. It was a Tuesday morning. I was in the truck before anyone else was up. I was doing prep, and I put on a playlist I hadn't listened to in a while.
Hold that thought, because I want to know what happened when the weeks turned into months, when the fracture started to become something else. Tell me about the first morning you woke up and thought, okay, something has shifted.
And the first song that came on was something Rachel had sent me the previous spring, before any of this, before October, before the phone. She'd texted me a link and said, "You have to hear this. It sounds like a late Sunday afternoon." And she was right, it did. And I'd added it to a playlist and then mostly forgotten about it. The song came on. And instead of it being connected to everything that had happened since, it was just the song, exactly the way it was in the spring, still sounding like a late Sunday afternoon. And I realized that the song didn't know anything had changed. The music hadn't been altered by what I now knew. It was still just light through a window. And I thought, okay, the before still exists. It's still in there. It didn't get erased. That's not healing, exactly. But it was the first indication that healing might be possible.
That's a remarkable thing to locate the moment when you realize the past doesn't have to be rewritten, just recontextualized. You talked earlier about vertigo, about everything looking the same but from a different angle. This sounds like the beginning of finding your footing in that shifted room.
That's exactly the right way to say it. finding your footing in the shifted room, because the room didn't go back to the way it was. It never will, but you can learn where the furniture is now. You can stop running into the corners in the dark. The truck, mostly, which I've said already, but I want to say it differently this time, because it wasn't just distraction. At some point, I think it was early December, so maybe 6 weeks after October, I realized that the thing I was doing on the truck wasn't running away from the situation. It was practicing the thing I most needed to practice, which was something is not working, you adjust it, you try again, you stay in it. Every recipe I tested and failed and reworked and tried again was a small physical lesson in the same skill, and I needed those lessons. I also started calling Rachel more. Not to talk about Tom, not to process the situation, just to talk to my sister, to find out what she'd been reading, to hear about whatever watercolor project she was working on or not working on, to tell her about a customer who'd asked for something off the menu and how I'd riffed on it.
Tell me about what you were doing concretely in those months to find your footing, not the philosophical version, the Tuesday morning version. What did you actually do?
The ordinary conversation we'd always had, which had gotten swallowed in the weight of everything else, and which I needed back. And then there was the morning, I remember exactly, it was a Wednesday in early February, overcast and about 12 degrees. The worst kind of Columbus February morning when I stopped at Rachel's house on my way to the truck. I did this sometimes just to check in. And she opened the door and she had paint on her left hand. Not a lot, just a small blue-green smear across two of her fingers that she hadn't noticed was there. And I pointed at it, and she looked at her hand, and she looked back at me. And I said, "You found the light." And she said, a little bit of it. And she smiled at me, not the composed smile from the kitchen table back in October, not the smile that was doing most of the work of not falling apart, just a regular Rachel smile. The one she's always had, the one that reaches her eyes because there's nothing behind it that it has to work around. I went to the truck and I made the best breakfast service I'd had in months. I'm not saying that's cause and effect, but I'm also not saying it.
That image paint on her fingers, a little bit of the light found is going to stay with me. There's something about the specificity of blue-green on two fingers that makes it so much realer than anything a person could say about recovery. You didn't hear Rachel say, "I'm getting better." You saw the evidence on her hand.
That's the thing about evidence. It's more trustworthy than words sometimes. Not because words are dishonest, but because evidence doesn't have to decide what to tell you. It just is.
In those months, January into February, what was the texture of your days? I want the unglamorous version, not the epiphany mornings, the ordinary ones.
The ordinary ones were pretty quiet, actually. I got into a rhythm that I hadn't had before. Up early, prep, first spot, second spot, close the truck, go home. I started cooking real dinners instead of just eating whatever was left at the end of service, which sounds small, but it was the first time in months I was making something for myself instead of just to test or to sell. There's something specific about cooking for one person at the end of a long day, the attention it takes, the care of it, even if it's just pasta that felt like an act of return. Like I was coming back to something. I also started calling my dad more, not about any of it, just to talk about sports, mostly, which is the language we have. But underneath the sports talk, there was something else running, some channel that had been opened between us by standing in that kitchen together and that neither of us had to name directly. We'd just check in. How's it going? Fine. You good? Yeah. See you Sunday. Okay. And every one of those calls did something I could not have articulated at the time, but which I now think was simply this. It reminded both of us that we were still us, that the shape of the family had changed, but the family had not.
That's one of the quieter forms of grief work, the phone call that's not about the grief, but that's doing grief work anyway. The sports talk that is also not sports talk.
Yeah, we are a family of people who do things sideways. I mean, I found out everything important in my family's life by picking up a phone that wasn't mine. We're not exactly known for our direct approach.
And what was the first time you laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one about any of this? Because humor, the ability to find the absurd edge of something painful, is often the first sign that a person has some distance from it.
March. Rachel and I were at Sunday dinner, and somehow the conversation got onto the subject of Tom's playlists. He has a very specific taste in music that had always been a kind of benign point of teasing. And Rachel said something about how she should have known because of the playlists. And I made a joke about the specific playlist in question. And Rachel laughed, like really laughed, the full thing, the laugh that goes through your whole body. And then I laughed. And for about 30 seconds, we were just two people losing it at the kitchen table over a music joke that was also underneath it about everything else. And my mum, who did not entirely follow what we were laughing about, laughed anyway because laughing is contagious and because she'd been waiting 6 months for us to do it. That was the turning point. That was the first sign that the weight could be set down sometimes. Not forever, just sometimes.
In those months of January and February, as you were finding your footing, what was Rachel actually doing? Not just the painting. What was her daily life looking like?
She was talking to a therapist. She'd started that in November, pretty early in the aftermath. And she was consistent about it in a way I think she would not have been if she hadn't made a real decision to be. She told me once that the hardest thing about therapy was not the conversations themselves, but the drive home afterward. 20 minutes alone in the car with whatever had been stirred up in the room. She got very familiar with the parking lot of a Whole Foods about halfway between a therapist's office and her house because she needed those stops. She'd sit there for 10 or 15 minutes before she felt ready to drive again. I find that detail oddly comforting. The parking lot of a Whole Foods. That's where some of her actual healing happened. Not in a retreat, not in a beautiful moment with perfect lighting, in a parking lot, in her car, in the middle of a grocery run.
And Tom, in those same months,
Tom was figuring out who he was on the other side of the secret, which I think is an enormous task that most people dramatically underestimate. Being closeted for that long, the particular violence of it, the way it requires you to keep a version of yourself constantly hidden, to monitor your own reactions, to edit yourself in real time in every room you're in. When that ends, when you step out of it, you don't just immediately become the full person you've always been. You have to find that person. You have to learn what you actually like and how you actually move through the world and what your face actually does when you're not managing it. That's not a small thing. That's years of work. Tom started that work in the months after October, slowly. I don't know all the details because it's his story and he's entitled to privacy in it, but I know he found a therapist too. And I know he started letting himself be known in small ways that he hadn't been before. And I know that by January, when I'd run into him at Sunday dinners, the occasional times he came, he looked lighter than I'd ever seen him. Not happy, exactly, but more present, like the lamp had been turned back up.
did you and Tom ever have another conversation beyond the bar, beyond the first one after your parents found out? Did you get to know each other differently in those months?
We did. It happened gradually. We started texting not about Rachel, not about the situation, just conversation. He'd send me something about a game. I'd send him something about a new ingredient I'd found. The kind of texts you send someone when you just feel like being in contact with them without it having to mean anything specific. And then in February, we got lunch, just the two of us. And we talked for about 2 hours. And for maybe the last 40 minutes of it, we talked about what the future might look like for him. Not in a heavy way, more in the way of two people who are genuinely curious about each other's lives. And at some point, he said, and I think about this a lot, he said, "The version of me you met 4 years ago was real, Jake. I need you to know that. He was real. He just wasn't the whole thing." And I said, "I know. I've always known that." And we paid the check and went back to our lives.
Can I ask you something about Rachel in this period that I think is the center of everything? Not about her well being, you've been clear she was finding her way, but about her and Tom. In those months, what were they to each other? You said earlier they were trying to figure that out. What did you observe?
What I observed was two people who genuinely did not stop caring about each other and who were trying to find a form for that caring that didn't require the form they'd had before, which is one of the harder things humans try to do. There's no script for it. There's no name for what they were to each other, not married anymore, not strangers, not friends exactly, not exes in the ordinary way the word implies. Something that doesn't have a box yet. I watched them at a Sunday dinner in March, one of the first times Tom had come back, and they were sitting at opposite ends of the table. And occasionally they'd look at each other when someone said something funny, the way people do when they share a reference point. And there was this moment where Rachel laughed at something my dad said and looked up and caught Tom looking at her. And instead of it being awkward, instead of one of them looking away, they just held it for a second. Just two people acknowledging that the laugh was funny and that they both still knew how funny the other one found things. I don't know what to call that, but I know what it looked like. It looked like two people who were going to be okay.
That look between them across the table, it calls back to something you said very early tonight about Tom glancing over at Rachel from the grill in the July backyard. The same gesture, a completely different context, and yet the tenderness in it is recognizable. That's what I mean when I say the love was real. The gesture is the same. The relationship has changed everything around it, and the gesture is still the same.
Yeah, I hadn't connected those two moments until just now, but yeah.
Jake, you described Rachel at the beginning of tonight as someone who can see light that other people walk past without noticing. And then we came to this moment in November where she sat at the blank page and couldn't find it. And now you're describing paint on her fingers in February. What's your sense of where she is now with the light?
She's finding it again. Not in all the old places. Some of the old places are closed to her now, or at least they look different, but she's finding it in new ones. She did a series of paintings in the spring. She put them up on Etsy and they sold out inside of a week, which has never happened before. The series was called February Windows. All variations on the same idea, windows from the inside, looking out. Sometimes the outside was bright, sometimes it was grey. In one of them, the glass had condensation on it, water droplets catching light in this way that made everything outside look blurred and soft and just barely reachable. And I bought that one. I have it in my apartment. It's across from where I drink my morning coffee, and some mornings I look at it and think she did get through, she found it. A little bit of it, it's right there on the wall.
Rachel, the straight spouse, at the center of this story, not just surviving, but making art again, making art about windows and the light on the other side of them.
Yeah, that's her. That's who she's always been. Even when she couldn't access it for a while, the art was always in there. She just had to find the angle.
I want to ask you about Rachel and Tom now, not the marriage, not the crisis, but where things actually stand between them today. You've hinted at it. Tell me the real picture.
The real picture is that they're in each other's lives. Not as husband and wife. The divorce was finalized in April. The paperwork quiet and agreed upon and without drama, which I think was the most Tom and Rachel thing it could possibly have been. But as people who are going to know each other for the rest of their lives because they love the same family and because they spent 4 years genuinely caring for each other, and that doesn't just turn off. Tom came to my dad's birthday in May. Not because he was obligated to, because Rachel asked if he wanted to, and he said yes. And my dad said, come over. And he came over and sat in the backyard, and my dad grilled, and my mum made the German chocolate cake that she's been making for my dad's birthday since before I was born. And Tom had two pieces and said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. And my dad looked very satisfied about that. Is it complicated? Yes. Is it a little strange sometimes? Yes. But strange and complicated are not the same as wrong. They're just the shape of what it actually is, which is a family that got reorganized and is still figuring out its new configuration, and which contains, somewhere near the center of it, a person who hurt someone they loved and a person who was hurt, and both of them still at the same table. I think that's actually something, I think that's more than a lot of people manage.
How would you describe your relationship with Tom now, not in the context of family events, but personally? What is he to you?
He's someone I respect. That's the most honest thing I can say. Not in a formal, distant way, in the way you respect someone who has come through something hard and is trying to do it with integrity. He texts me when a new cooking show drops that he thinks I'd like. Last month, he came to one of my lunch spots and ordered the jalapeno carnitas and sent me a text afterward that just said, permanent menu item, do it. So I'm working on it. There's a friendship happening there, slowly, in the margins. Nothing forced, nothing announced, just two people who ended up on the same side of something and are finding their way to each other on the other side of it.
And something you said you'd be grateful for even in spite of everything. The pattern interrupt you mentioned. What is it that surprised you?
I'm grateful that I know my sister better now. That sounds strange, I realize. We were always close. But there's a version of closeness that lives on the surface of things, where you know someone's habits and their humor and their history, and you mistake the familiar for the deep. And then something cracks everything open and you get to see who they actually are when they can't protect themselves with the familiar anymore. And what I found when that happened with Rachel, what she is, when all the composure is stripped away, when she's sitting at a blank page in February in the weak winter light, is someone so specific and so resilient and so genuinely, stubbornly committed to finding the beautiful thing, even in the middle of the grey that I think I had been taking for granted. I had known she was extraordinary. I hadn't fully known why. I know now. And weirdly, and I want to be clear that this comes with a lot of weirdly, I'm grateful for Tom too. For the person I got to know in those lunches and those bar conversations after everything, the full person, not the managed version, the one who talks about coaching high school kids with this light in his eyes that I realized was always there. I just hadn't been looking for it. The one who turns out to have a very extensive and embarrassing knowledge of early 2000s pop music that he'd been hiding for the entire 4 years. I knew him. The one who, when I asked him last summer why he'd gotten into coaching in the first place, talked for 20 minutes about a coach he'd had at 16 who had made him feel visible at a time when he was working very hard not to be. That's the Tom I get to know now. That's the version that couldn't exist before. I'll take the bittersweet. I'll take it.
Jake, I want to sit with your story for a little longer before we bring the audience in, because there are things in what you've shared tonight that I think deserve more than just moving past them.
Yeah, sure.
The first thing I want to name is something psychologists call ambiguous loss. And I think it's the exact technical term for what you're describing when you talk about the vertigo, when you talk about the before still existing but recontextualized. Ambiguous loss is what happens when something you have lost is still in some form present. The marriage ended, but Tom is still at your dad's birthday dinner. The version of your family that existed before October is gone, but the love inside it is still there. The Rachel who painted from a place of unknowing is gone, but the Rachel who found the light again is in some ways more fully herself. Ambiguous loss is uniquely destabilizing because grief has nowhere definitive to land. You can't mourn the way you would mourn something that has simply disappeared. What you've been navigating and what your whole family has been navigating is how to hold the loss and the continuing presence at the same time. And there is no clean psychological protocol for that. There's just the slow, imperfect work of holding both without requiring them to resolve.
That's the word for it. I've been trying to find that word for months.
The second thing I want to talk about is something that I find underrepresented in the way we typically tell these stories, and that's the experience of the peripheral family member. Rachel is the straight spouse. Tom is the LGBT person who came out. But you, Jake, you are something that doesn't have a role name in this particular drama. You are the person who found out accidentally, who was not the primary holder of the secret and not the primary recipient of the disclosure, but who was inside the damage radius of the blast. Psychologists call this secondary trauma, not the original wound, but the wound you sustained from proximity to someone else's wound. It is real, it is measurable, and I think it matters to name it because people in your position often don't give themselves permission to grieve. They spend all their energy being what other people need, what you described when you said you needed to not fall apart so that Rachel could, and they don't allocate any space for what this took from them personally. The ramen on the floor, the crying behind the steam table on the day after Thanksgiving, those were not indulgences. Those were necessary. Did you ever give yourself full permission to need something for yourself out of this?
The ramen on the floor, that was the beginning of it. And the 45 minutes crying behind the steam table on the day after Thanksgiving. And honestly, I think this conversation is part of it, because saying it out loud to someone who is actually listening that does something different than saying it inside your own head. The words become more real when another person can hold them. I've never fully understood that until right now. That's exactly accurate. And I appreciate you making that distinction because I think I had been conflating them. I understand everything. I don't know if I've forgiven everything. And I think that's okay. I think it might be exactly the right place to be.
The third thing, and this is the one that I think has the most to offer, anyone listening who is in the early, raw, just found out stage of what you've described, is about the difference between understanding and forgiveness. Because those two things get collapsed all the time, and I think collapsing them is actually harmful. Understanding is a cognitive act. It means you have access to the reasons something happened. You understand why Tom stayed in the marriage for 4 years. You understand why Rachel kept the secret for 4 months. You understand why everyone did what they did. That understanding is real and it's valuable. But it is not the same as forgiveness, which is a much more personal, much more specifically chosen act, which each person gets to define for themselves on their own timeline, which nobody can be required to perform on demand, and which does not require the other party's acknowledgement, agreement, or reciprocation to be meaningful. What I hear in your story, and I want to be careful not to put words in your mouth, is someone who has done a lot of understanding and who is still deciding case by case and day by day what forgiveness means. Is that accurate?
That's exactly accurate. And I appreciate you making that distinction because I think I had been conflating them. I understand everything. I don't know if I've forgiven everything. And I think that's okay. I think it might be exactly the right place to be.
The fourth thing, and I want to come back to the question that opened this episode, the one about the silence inside a happy family, is about what this story actually tells us about secrets. Not the moral dimension of keeping them, but the structural reality of what they do to the person carrying them. Tom carried a truth for close to 15 years that he could not find a way to put down. The weight of that, the cost to him as a human being, the years of self-monitoring and performance and editing is enormous. And I think it gets overlooked in conversations that focus primarily on the harm the secret caused to others. Both are real. Both deserve acknowledgement. But I want to say clearly, there is a direct connection between Tom's suffering inside the closet and the suffering his silence caused Rachel and your family. The silence was not a free choice made by a person with full options. It was the only available exit from a kind of internal violence. And understanding that doesn't excuse the damage. It just makes the whole picture true. What you opened this conversation asking whether the love that lived inside that silence can still be real, I think your story answers that. The love was real, the silence was real, the damage was real, and none of those three things cancels out either of the others. They are all simultaneously true. And learning to hold all three of them without requiring one of them to win is, I think, the hardest and most necessary human skill there is. That's the question narrator asked at the beginning of tonight, rephrased. Not whether the silence was justified, but whether the love inside it survived. And what Jake's story tells us specifically, in the details, in the jalapeno carnitas and the paint on 2 fingers and the dishes washed by 2 men who did not know how to say anything else, is that love is more durable than silence. That it persists in forms you don't expect. That it shows up in a parking lot outside a Whole Foods and at a birthday dinner in May and in a football player knocking helmets with his coach on a November practice field. Love doesn't require the clean story. It just keeps showing up.
I came in tonight not knowing if I had anything useful to say about any of this. I just knew the story. But I think you just put into words the thing I've been trying to figure out for 6 months. So thank you for that.
Thank you for trusting me with it. Jake, I want to bring our audience in now because they've been here with us tonight and what they have to say matters. I'll be right here. We received an extraordinary number of responses to tonight's story before it aired. People sharing their own experiences, their own versions of the phone on the counter, the blank page, the bittersweet middle. Let me bring some of those voices in now. Donna from Baton Rouge, Louisiana shares this. I am 11 years out from the night I found out about my husband. 11 years. And hearing Jake describe those 3 days of going to work and making change and smiling at people, I could feel every second of it in my body. I remember making coffee the morning after. The machine ran, I poured the cup, I stood in the kitchen holding it, and it was the most normal thing in the world and also completely impossible. I want Jake and Rachel and anyone who just found out to know this. The vertigo doesn't last forever. You find the furniture. You learn where the corners are. I coach high school history now, and I have a life I genuinely love. And my ex-husband and I had coffee last month for the first time, and we talked about our kids for 90 minutes, and it was completely ordinary and completely extraordinary at the same time. You get to the other side. It takes longer than anyone tells you. But you do, that's a long road with a lot of honesty in it. Thank you, Donna. Timothy from Birmingham, Alabama writes, I'm a pastor and I've counseled several couples through this exact situation over 20 years of ministry. What this show gets right, what I wish more people understood, is that this is not a story of one person's sin against another. It is a story of two people trapped by a world that did not give them good options. My faith tells me that every human being is made in the image of God, and that image is in Tom just as fully as it is in Rachel. Tom is not a villain in the story of Rachel's suffering. He is a man who was formed by a world that gave him nowhere safe, to be honest. What Tom needed was a culture willing to hold his truth before the wedding, not after. That is not a failure of character. That is the failure of every institution and community that made honesty feel more dangerous than silence. There's a theological precision in that observation that I want to sit with, and a generosity that I think is exactly right. Anonymous, a username that reads as quietly chosen, writes this: I've watched every episode of this show, and I keep waiting for someone to ask the accountability question directly. So I'll ask it. At what point does understanding someone's pain excuse the harm they caused? Rachel lost 4 years. Her grief is real. Tom's suffering is also real. But suffering doesn't cancel harm, and comprehensibility doesn't equal absolution. I think the show does important and necessary work. I also think it can tip in the direction of making the LGBT person's internal experience so understandable that the straight spouse's concrete loss becomes secondary. Rachel deserved better than to be collateral damage in someone else's self-discovery. Both things can be true simultaneously. I want the show to say both things out loud without requiring us to weight them. That challenge is the most important kind, the one that refuses a comfortable resolution. And if tonight's conversation has stirred something in you, something you've been carrying without a name for it, leave a comment, subscribe, find us. The people in this community have been exactly where you are, and they show up in the comment section with an honesty that I have never seen anywhere else online. From Phoenix, Arizona, username Watercolor Studio writes, I am a gay woman who was married to a man for 6 years before I found the courage to come out. I've never heard anyone describe the experience of making art from inside a closeted life with this kind of precision. Rachel's work, the light through windows, the small moments of brightness in ordinary spaces, that is exactly what it feels like to create when you're hiding. You become obsessed with light because you cannot live in it directly. You paint toward the thing you most need and least have access to. I owe my ex-husband more than I know how to express. I see him in Jake, the person who picked up the phone, who sat on the floor, who showed up even when he didn't know why. Those people are doing something extraordinary. I need them to know that they matter to us too. The connection between Rachel's art and the interior experience of making it from inside a closed space, that reframing lands somewhere very real. Marcus from Dayton, Ohio writes, no one talks honestly about how much work it takes to not hate someone when they have earned your hatred. People treat forgiveness like it's either automatic, you love them, therefore you forgive, or irrelevant. Why would you forgive someone who hurt you? Neither of those is the experience. The experience is you make a choice repeatedly every time the anger comes back, not to let it become the only true thing about the situation. Jake said he still believes Tom. I respect that. I'm not there yet with my own situation. 8 years, I'm not ready to believe the person yet. And I don't think I should have to be ready on anyone else's timeline. I'm tired of narratives, even generous ones, that imply the person who arrives at grace first is the morally superior one. There is an important sovereignty in that position. Your timeline belongs to you. Priya from Seattle, Washington shares, I was in my best friend's kitchen the night she found out about her husband 6 years ago now. I didn't have any of the right words. I still don't know what the right words were. What I did was stay. I stayed for 6 hours that night. I made tea. Neither of us drank. I sat on the floor with her when she needed to be on the floor. Jake sitting on the floor of the painting room, that is the most accurate description I have read of what the people on the periphery of these situations do. We stay. We don't always know what we're staying for. We don't always know if we're helping, but staying is the thing. The staying is the actual act of love. I want everyone who has ever stayed to know that it mattered. It mattered to my friend. I know it mattered. The ministry of staying. Yes, full stop. And finally, from Cameron, 22 years old, no location given. I am queer and not out to my family yet. I watch this show because I am genuinely terrified of becoming the person who causes this kind of damage to someone I love. I know what the closet does. I have been living in it, and I know it is not neutral, that it costs me and that it will cost whoever I am with if I stay in it too long. What I want to ask sincerely, not rhetorically, is how do we build the world where the next gay person can be honest before the wedding instead of after? How do we make sure the next Tom never has to sit across from the next Rachel with a truth that has been underground for 15 years? I'm asking because I don't want to be that person. I'm asking because I want to know if it's possible to do this differently. I think it might be, but I need to believe the world I'm coming out into is one that can hold me. Cameron, that question is the most important question anyone has asked in 7 episodes of this show. And the answer is, we build that world by doing exactly this. By telling these stories without softening what was hard about them. By holding the complexity without requiring a villain. By making it so publicly and so clearly true that no one needs to hide that the next person standing at Cameron's particular crossroads finds the door already open. That is how. You are already part of how. Jake, these voices have been here with us tonight.
Yeah, they have. Thank you for reading them.
Jake Novak, 26 years old, food truck, Columbus, Ohio. The person who picked up the wrong phone on the right afternoon and found himself in the middle of a story that wasn't his and became his anyway, because that is what family means. That the stories of people you love become yours, whether you chose them or not. I am grateful for how honestly you showed up tonight for the ramen on the floor and the paint on Rachel's fingers and your dad at the sink with the water running and all of it. The whole unmanaged, specific, alive truth of it. To everyone listening, if Jake's story landed somewhere in you, if you heard something of your own experience in these 2 hours, you know what to do. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, leave a comment. I am grateful for how honestly you showed up tonight for the ramen on the floor and the paint on Rachel's fingers and your dad at the sink with the water running and all of it. The whole unmanaged, specific, alive truth of it. To everyone listening, if Jake's story landed somewhere in you, if you heard something of your own experience in these 2 hours, you know what to do. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, leave a comment. The next person who finds the show might be exactly where Jake was 6 months ago, standing in someone's driveway, not yet knowing what to do with what they know. And the fact that this exists, that this conversation exists, might be the thing that makes the next day a little less impossible for them. That's why we do this. Jake, a year from now, what do you hope is different?
I hope Rachel is selling out her next series. I hope Tom has found a version of himself he's allowed to be all the way. I hope my dad has figured out how to say thank you to Marcus, because I think he wants to and just doesn't know how to start that particular conversation. I hope my mom has found the peace she's still working toward. And I hope I've got the jalapeno carnitas on a permanent menu item because I've been workshopping it for 6 months and it's almost ready. Tom says it is. I'm almost ready to believe him.
I hope all of those things with you. This has been The Straight Spouse. I'm Harvey. We'll see you next week.